Before sunrise, inside one of the most guarded institutions on Earth, something extraordinary happened. A message arrived quiet, procedural, almost bureaucratic in appearance. But the content of that message would trigger a chain reaction that shook palace corridors from London to Geneva. Because when Sophie opened the legal notice blocking her access to the Queen's private Swiss accounts, one question immediately echoed through the palace walls. Who ordered this and what were they trying to hide? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The message itself did not arrive with drama. There was no raised voice, no urgent phone call, no immediate alarm that something extraordinary had occurred. Instead, it appeared in the most controlled way imaginable, delivered formally, wrapped in the careful language of palace legal procedure. But those who were present that morning would later say that the moment Sophie finished reading the notice, the air in the room changed. The document stated that her request to review a set of private financial accounts associated with the late monarch had been denied. The wording was deliberate, almost cold. Palace legal advisors cited what they called confidential fiduciary restrictions, a phrase so deliberately vague that it raised more questions than it answered. It was not a refusal built on explanation. It was a wall. For Sophie, that wall came as a shock. For years, she had been known inside royal circles as one of the most measured and diplomatic members of the family. Calm, composed, rarely confrontational. Staff often described her as the person who could quietly resolve problems before they ever became public complications. But according to insiders who witnessed the moment, this time something was different. The document seemed to strike a nerve because the accounts mentioned in that legal notice were not ordinary accounts. They were believed to be part of a discrete financial structure the Queen had maintained privately for decades, separate from the widely known royal finances and known only to a small inner circle. Funds that had been managed quietly, protected carefully, and rarely discussed outside of highly confidential briefings. What made the refusal even more unsettling was the reason Sophie had requested access in the first place. According to palace whispers, documents had surfaced weeks earlier suggesting that she had once been identified as a potential overseer of certain confidential funds tied to the Queen's personal estate. The suggestion alone was extraordinary. It implied a level of trust that very few individuals had ever been granted, which meant that Sophie's request had not been random curiosity. It had been based on the belief that she had been entrusted with responsibility. And now, suddenly, the palace legal team was claiming the opposite. The reaction from those around her was immediate but quiet. Staff members exchanged uneasy looks as the implications began to sink in. If Sophie believed she had legitimate authority connected to those accounts, then the legal refusal was more than procedural. It was a contradiction. And contradictions inside the royal household rarely remain simple misunderstandings. Within minutes, aides began reviewing the wording of the notice again, searching for clarity that wasn't there. The explanation remained frustratingly opaque. Confidential fiduciary restrictions, nothing more. But Sophie's response was unmistakable. Instead of accepting the decision quietly, she asked a single question that would ripple through the palace before the morning was over. Who had authorized the restriction? It was not asked angrily at first. It was asked carefully, almost analytically. But everyone present understood what it meant, because in the complex machinery of royal administration, a decision like this did not appear from nowhere. Someone had approved it. Someone had decided that Sophie, someone who believed she had been trusted with oversight, should suddenly be blocked from even reviewing the accounts. That realization triggered a quiet but urgent scramble among palace staff. Phone calls began moving through legal offices and financial departments. Advisors started speaking in lowered voices. Rumors began moving between royal households, each version slightly different but carrying the same core question. Sophie had demanded an explanation from senior legal counsel, and the matter was no longer contained within a single office. Within hours, whispers were circulating that something unusual was unfolding behind palace walls, and those whispers quickly turned into speculation. Because if the Swiss accounts truly existed, and if Sophie genuinely believed she had authority connected to them, then the decision to block her access raised a troubling possibility. Someone inside the palace structure had intervened. Someone had placed a barrier between Sophie and a financial legacy that the Queen had guarded for decades. The deeper aides looked into the situation, the more unsettling the implications became. What had begun as a legal notice was rapidly evolving into something far more complicated. But the deeper Sophie looked into the situation, the more disturbing the picture became, because the story of those Swiss accounts didn't begin with lawyers. It began decades earlier with a secret the Queen had protected her entire life. For decades, the monarchy operated with two worlds of wealth: the public fortune everyone knew about, and the private financial architecture only a handful of trusted figures ever saw. Somewhere deep inside that hidden system were Swiss accounts linked directly to the Queen herself, accounts whispered about among bankers and royal advisors, but rarely acknowledged. And now, suddenly those same accounts had become the center of a palace confrontation. As Sophie continued examining the legal notice that had arrived that morning, another realization slowly began to surface. The document blocking her access was not simply about one request being denied. It was about a financial structure that had existed quietly for generations, one that had rarely been discussed openly, even inside the royal household itself. For decades, the monarchy had maintained a carefully balanced system of wealth. On one side were the public estates, the crown assets that the world recognized and scrutinized. On the other side was something far more discreet: a network of private holdings that existed beyond the public narrative of royal finances, managed quietly and protected with extraordinary secrecy. Among those whispered about assets were the Swiss accounts, not rumors created by gossip, but long-standing financial arrangements believed to have been established many years earlier. In certain circles among financial advisors, bankers, and a few senior palace officials, these accounts had been spoken of in hushed tones. They were said to represent a layer of personal financial security connected directly to the Queen's private legacy. Unlike official royal wealth, which carried obligations to the state and public transparency, these funds reportedly belonged entirely to the Queen's personal financial world. And that difference made them both powerful and incredibly sensitive. The choice of Switzerland had never been accidental. Swiss banking traditions were built on one principle above all others: confidentiality. For generations, those institutions had provided a discreet refuge for private assets belonging to powerful individuals around the world. Within the context of the monarchy, such accounts offered something invaluable: control. Control over personal financial resources that could remain untouched by political scrutiny, media speculation, or government oversight. It was a structure designed not for public display, but for protection. Palace insiders had occasionally hinted that these accounts were established decades earlier, possibly during a time when the royal family faced complex financial pressures and global political changes. The intention, according to those familiar with the arrangement, was not extravagance but security. Certain personal funds tied to royal estates, historic inheritances, and confidential projects could be managed quietly without drawing public attention. It was, in many ways, a financial safeguard built into the monarchy's private life. But perhaps the most intriguing part of this hidden structure involved who knew about it. During the Queen's lifetime, knowledge of the accounts was believed to be restricted to an extremely small group of trusted individuals: senior financial advisors, legal specialists, and a handful of confidants who had earned the Queen's absolute trust over many years. The secrecy was not accidental, it was deliberate, because once knowledge of such accounts spread too widely, the very purpose of their discretion could be compromised. And that was precisely where Sophie's situation became so complicated. According to documents that had quietly circulated among certain palace advisors, Sophie had not been entirely unaware of this financial system. Years earlier, during a series of confidential briefings connected to estate planning discussions, she had reportedly been introduced to aspects of the Queen's private financial arrangements. The conversations had been careful, measured, and deeply private, but the implication had been unmistakable. Sophie had been allowed to see a part of the monarchy's financial world that very few outsiders had ever been shown. Over time, that introduction may have carried a deeper meaning. Some documents hinted that the Queen had considered assigning Sophie a role connected to safeguarding parts of that private financial structure in the future, not as a public responsibility, but as a quiet guardian of certain confidential funds that would continue to exist long after the Queen herself was gone. It was the kind of trust that was never announced publicly, but carried enormous significance behind palace doors, which was why the legal refusal Sophie received now felt so jarring. Because if those earlier conversations had meant what she believed they meant, then the decision to block her access was not merely procedural. It was a direct contradiction of the understanding she thought had been established years earlier. Somewhere between the Queen's private intentions and the palace legal team's current position, something had changed. The lawyers now insisted that Sophie held no authority whatsoever over the accounts. No oversight, no access, no responsibility. Their language was firm and unyielding, but that position stood in sharp conflict with the quiet narrative Sophie believed had been built through years of trust and private conversations. The more she examined the situation, the clearer the tension became. Two versions of the truth were emerging, one rooted in the Queen's private legacy, the other enforced by the palace's legal structure. And that contradiction between what Sophie believed she had been promised and what the lawyers now claimed would push her to confront the palace establishment directly. Inside royal circles, Sophie had long been known as the steady one, the diplomat, the quiet problem solver who rarely made demands, which is why what happened next left palace aides stunned, because the woman who normally avoided confrontation suddenly issued a message that insiders say carried unmistakable fury. She wanted answers immediately to understand why the moment felt so explosive behind palace doors. One had to understand who Sophie had always been within the complicated machinery of the royal household. For years, she had cultivated a reputation that few others in the monarchy managed to maintain calm under pressure, composed in public and fiercely loyal behind the scenes. Staff members often described her as the quiet, stabilizing force within a family known for its storms. While other royal figures occasionally found themselves pulled into controversy or tension, Sophie had built her identity on something far less dramatic: quiet competence. She handled responsibilities without spectacle, mediated difficult situations without drawing attention, and maintained a level of discretion that made senior advisors trust her in ways they rarely trusted anyone else. That reputation had not appeared overnight. It had been built slowly through years of reliability. Palace staff knew that when Sophie was assigned to delicate matters, the outcome was almost always the same: calm resolution, without public disruption. She understood the unspoken rule that governed royal survival. Sometimes the most powerful move was the one that happened quietly, and it was precisely because she understood that rule so well that her reaction to the blocked Swiss account sent such shockwaves through palace corridors. Because Sophie was not someone who issued demands lightly. Those who had watched her relationship with the Queen develop over the years knew that it carried a depth that went beyond ceremonial duties. The Queen had always valued loyalty above nearly everything else, and insiders often said Sophie embodied that quality perfectly. Over time, their relationship had reportedly grown into something closer to private trust than public obligation. While official meetings with advisors were carefully documented and structured, there were also quieter conversations that took place away from formal settings, conversations where sensitive matters could be discussed without the pressure of public scrutiny. It was during some of those private exchanges, according to individuals familiar with palace dynamics, that the Queen had occasionally spoken about financial matters tied to her personal estate, not the public finances that everyone understood, but the quieter structure that existed behind them. Discussions that were cautious, measured, and deeply confidential, the kind of conversations that would only happen with someone the Queen believed she could rely on completely. Over time, Sophie had come to believe that those discussions carried a deeper meaning. They were not simply casual remarks about financial arrangements. They suggested that the Queen had been considering how certain private assets would be safeguarded long after she was gone. And within those quiet conversations, Sophie believed she had been entrusted with a role perhaps not publicly declared, but unmistakably implied, a role connected to protecting aspects of the Queen's private financial legacy, which was why the legal notice denying her access had struck her with such force. From Sophie's perspective, it wasn't simply an administrative refusal. It was the collapse of an understanding she believed had been carefully built over years of trust. For someone who rarely challenged palace authority, the decision to confront the legal team represented something profound. It meant that the situation had crossed a line she could not ignore. When word spread that Sophie had formally requested an explanation from palace lawyers, many staff members struggled to believe it at first, not because she lacked the authority, but because confrontation had never been her style. Yet this time she refused to remain silent. According to insiders, her request was delivered clearly and directly. She wanted to know why her access had been blocked, and more importantly, she wanted to know who had made that decision. That single question immediately shifted the entire tone of the situation, because within the palace system, decisions about sensitive financial accounts did not appear from nowhere. Someone had signed off on the restriction. Someone had placed that barrier in her path, and once Sophie asked who that person was, the inquiry stopped being a legal matter and started becoming something far more complicated, a search for control. Within hours, advisors and legal staff found themselves revisiting documents, permissions, and authority structures connected to the accounts. The investigation that followed was quiet, but its implications were enormous, because if Sophie truly believed she had been entrusted with responsibility over those funds, and if someone else had intervened to remove that access, then the question of who controlled the Queen's private financial legacy suddenly became unavoidable. And that single question, who authorized the restriction, would begin pulling at threads inside the palace that no one had expected to unravel. Because when the lawyers finally prepared their response to Sophie's demand, it became clear that their explanation would not calm the situation. Instead, it would raise an even or unsettling possibility. But when palace lawyers finally responded to Sophie's demand, their explanation raised even more alarming possibilities. The answer Sophie received was not an explanation. It was a wall, a legal barrier built from clauses, confidentiality agreements, and carefully worded statements. According to palace lawyers, the Swiss accounts were now under restricted custodial oversight, but the real question remained: who had ordered that oversight and why had Sophie been excluded? The message delivered to Sophie after her demand for clarity was precise, controlled, and unmistakably final in its tone. Palace legal representatives did not raise their voices or show visible urgency. Instead, they relied on something far more effective within the royal system: carefully constructed language that left little room for argument. The accounts, they explained, were now governed by newly activated legal restrictions. These limitations, according to their statement, had taken effect automatically under what they described as posthumous financial protections. Following the Queen's passing, it sounded official, it sounded procedural. But to Sophie, the explanation felt less like transparency and more like deflection, because the more she listened, the more the answer seemed designed to avoid the one question she had actually asked: who had authorized the restriction? The lawyers spoke about regulations and obligations. They referenced protocols connected to private estates. They cited confidentiality agreements tied to international financial institutions. Yet through all of it, one detail remained strangely absent. No one named the individual who had triggered the oversight, now blocking her access. Within hours, Sophie's own legal advisors began quietly studying the documents the palace team had provided. The language was dense, filled with references to long-standing legal frameworks that governed private royal assets. But as her advisors examined the clauses more closely, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Certain sections referred to authority structures that appeared newly activated rather than historically established. Other phrases suggested that additional approvals had been inserted into the process after the Queen's death. It was not proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to make the situation feel far less straightforward than the palace lawyers had implied. At the same time, rumors began circulating among palace insiders who had caught fragments of the unfolding dispute. Some believed the explanation offered by the legal team was genuine, nothing more than the careful enforcement of financial safeguards designed to protect private royal assets during a transition period. But others whispered a far more unsettling possibility. What if the accounts were no longer simply dormant assets waiting for oversight? What if someone else had already assumed control over them? The idea spread quietly, but quickly. In a sesh, twice as hierarchical as the royal household, financial authority rarely existed in a vacuum. If Sophie's access had been blocked, it raised the possibility that another figure within the royal structure, had been granted the power she believed she possessed. No one said it openly at first, but the speculation was impossible to ignore, because whoever controlled those accounts would effectively hold influence over a part of the Queen's personal legacy that had never been intended for public scrutiny. Meanwhile, Sophie's team continued assembling fragments of evidence that supported her belief that something had changed after the Queen's death. Notes from earlier discussions, references to confidential briefings, quiet reminders of the trust the Queen had once expressed. None of it alone was decisive. But together, the pieces formed a pattern that made Sophie increasingly certain that the current restrictions did not reflect the understanding she had been given years earlier. The tension between the two sides began to grow quietly but steadily. Palace lawyers maintained their position with unwavering formality, insisting that the legal protections surrounding the accounts were both necessary and non-negotiable. Sophie, however, refused to accept that explanation as the final answer. Her position remained clear. If restrictions had been activated, someone had authorized them, and until that person was identified, the story remained incomplete. For Sophie, the issue was no longer simply about financial oversight. It had become a question of trust, a question of whether the understanding she believed she shared with the Queen had been quietly altered behind closed doors. Each response from the palace legal team seemed to create more distance rather than clarity, as though the truth itself was being carefully managed rather than revealed. And as the days passed, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted from quiet curiosity to unmistakable tension. Staff members spoke in lower voices. Advisors avoided speculation in public, but continued discussing the situation privately. Something important was being protected, but no one seemed certain exactly what it was. Then, almost unexpectedly, another rumor began circulating among those closest to the investigation. A whisper about a document, an old one, buried deep within private estate records. A document that, if it existed, might explain why the Swiss accounts had suddenly become so sensitive, and as questions multiplied, whispers began spreading about a document that might explain everything, a document that the palace had never intended Sophie to see. Late one evening, Sophie's advisors received something unexpected, a document quietly delivered by a source who refused to be identified. At first glance, it appeared routine, but buried in its pages was a reference that changed everything. A clause suggesting the Queen had left specific instructions regarding the Swiss accounts. The delivery itself was almost unnervingly discreet. There had been no official correspondence, no palace stamp, no traceable chain of communication, just a sealed envelope placed carefully into the hands of one of Sophie's senior advisors late in the evening, accompanied by a brief message that contained no name and no explanation. Whoever had provided it clearly understood the weight of what they were sharing, and just as clearly, they had taken great care to remain invisible. When the document was first opened, it did not immediately appear extraordinary. Its structure resembled the kind of legal material the palace dealt with: constantly structured language, formal phrasing, references to estate planning procedures. But as Sophie's advisors began examining the pages more closely, something unusual began to surface. In one section, embedded deep within the legal wording, was a clause that referred specifically to the Queen's personal directives regarding certain overseas financial holdings. Those holdings were not described openly. The language remained cautious and indirect, but the reference was unmistakable. It pointed directly toward the Swiss accounts that had suddenly become the center of Sophie's dispute with the palace legal team. The room fell quiet as the implications sank in, because if the document was genuine, it suggested that the Queen had not simply left the accounts to be managed by generic legal procedures. Instead, she had issued instructions, personal instructions, that defined how those assets should be handled after her passing. And within that clause was another detail that immediately caught Sophie's attention. The wording appeared to outline responsibilities connected to the accounts, responsibilities that could be assigned to a trusted individual within the royal structure. For Sophie, the moment felt like a confirmation of everything she had believed since the legal notice arrived. The quiet conversations she remembered having with the Queen suddenly seemed to align with the language inside the document. The references were not explicit, but they carried a tone of intention, a suggestion that the Queen had carefully considered who would safeguard certain aspects of her private financial legacy, and Sophie could not ignore the possibility that she had been the person those responsibilities were meant for. But the deeper her advisors studied the document, the more complicated the picture became, because while the clause seemed to support Sophie's understanding, it also contained an additional layer of conditions that had not been mentioned before. The text implied that access to the accounts might require approvals from other parties before the directives could be fully enacted. It was a subtle detail, but an important one. It meant that even if Sophie had been intended to oversee the funds, the structure surrounding the accounts might still allow other individuals to influence or delay that authority. When Sophie's team presented the document to palace lawyers, the response was swift and dismissive. The legal representatives did not deny that the clause existed, but they immediately challenged the interpretation being placed upon it. According to their reading, the language did not assign direct authority to any specific individual. Instead, they argued it simply described a framework for managing private assets under carefully controlled supervision. The disagreement escalated quickly. What Sophie's advisors saw as evidence of the Queen's personal intention, the palace lawyers described as a routine estate safeguard. Each side claimed the document supported their position, yet neither interpretation completely resolved the contradictions already surrounding the accounts. For Sophie, the situation was becoming increasingly frustrating. Every answer seemed to produce another layer of uncertainty. First, the legal restriction had appeared without explanation. Then the palace lawyers had insisted that the accounts were protected by automatic protocols. Now a document had surfaced suggesting the Queen herself had issued specific instructions about those same funds. Instead of clarity, the narrative was growing more tangled with every new discovery. And as the story spread quietly through palace circles, speculation intensified. Some insiders believed the document confirmed that Sophie had been meant to play a role in protecting the Queen's private assets. Others believed the conditions written into the clause hinted that another figure within the royal household might share control over the accounts. The idea that multiple individuals might have competing authority over the same financial legacy began to circulate among advisors. That possibility carried enormous implications, because if control of the accounts was not clearly defined, it meant the dispute Sophie was facing might not simply be a legal misunderstanding. It could represent something much deeper, a quiet struggle over who would ultimately inherit responsibility for one of the most discreet financial structures the monarchy had ever maintained. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the tension surrounding the accounts intensified dramatically. The legal debate was no longer confined to technical interpretation of estate language. It was now tangled with questions of loyalty, trust, and influence within the royal household itself. But if the document was real, and if it truly reflected the Queen's wishes, then someone inside the palace had a powerful reason to keep Sophie away from those accounts. Royal scandals rarely explode in public. More often, they unfold behind closed doors, in quiet meetings and carefully worded memos. And according to insiders, that's exactly what began happening as Sophie pushed for answers. Because the deeper she investigated the blocked Swiss accounts, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a financial dispute, it was a power struggle inside the palace itself. What had started as a simple request for access had now triggered something far more complicated inside the royal household. The quiet arrival of the mysterious document had forced senior advisors to confront a question they had not anticipated. If the Queen had truly left instructions regarding the Swiss accounts, then someone within the palace structure had decided deliberately to prevent those instructions from being acted upon. That realization shifted the tone of every conversation that followed. The matter was no longer conscient, innate to legal interpretation. It had become political. Within days, a series of private meetings began taking place among senior royal advisors. They were not publicly acknowledged, and they were certainly not announced to the press. But the frequency of these discussions told its own story. Financial consultants, legal representatives, and long-standing palace administrators found themselves called into discreet conversations that stretched late into the evening. The official subject was always the same: reviewing the legal status of the Queen's private financial arrangements. Yet behind the careful wording, everyone understood the real issue. Sophie's inquiry had forced the palace to confront an uncomfortable possibility. The Queen's intentions might not align with the current control structure surrounding the accounts, and once that possibility entered the discussion, divisions began to emerge. Some advisors believed the matter should be resolved quickly by granting Sophie the oversight she believed had been promised to her. They argued that ignoring the Queen's personal directives, if those directives were indeed real, could risk undermining the very principle of loyalty that the monarchy relied upon. From their perspective, the situation was simple. If the Queen had trusted Sophie with responsibility over the accounts, honouring that trust was not only appropriate, it was necessary. But others inside the palace structure viewed the situation very differently. For them, the issue was not loyalty, it was risk. The Swiss accounts were not ordinary financial assets. They represented one of the most discreet elements of the Queen's private legacy. Opening access to them, even for a trusted member of the royal family, could potentially expose information that had been carefully protected for decades. Some advisors insisted that the accounts should remain sealed until every possible legal implication had been examined. In their view, protecting the monarchy's reputation had to come before honouring any informal understandings. As these opposing perspectives hardened, the atmosphere within the palace began to change. Conversations that once moved smoothly through established chains of command now carried an undercurrent of tension. Advisors who normally spoke with confidence found themselves choosing their words more carefully. The issue had created something the royal household rarely tolerated: internal disagreement. Sophie's persistence only intensified that strain. She did not withdraw her request or soften her position. If anything, the discovery of the document strengthened her resolve. The more resistance she encountered, the more determined she became to uncover the truth behind the restrictions placed on the accounts. And with each new inquiry she made, the palace's internal divisions became harder to ignore. Eventually, the tension began leaking beyond the palace walls. It did not appear in official statements or formal briefings. Instead, it surfaced in the subtle way royal gossip often spreads through whispers among journalists, through fragments of information shared by sources who spoke just carefully enough to avoid direct confirmation. Suddenly, conversations about unusual legal disputes within the royal household began appearing in private media circles. Nothing explicit, nothing fully detailed, but enough to suggest that something unexpected was unfolding behind the palace gates. That development worried many within the royal establishment. The monarchy's survival had always depended on maintaining the image of unity and control. Internal disagreements were meant to remain invisible to the outside world. Yet Sophie's investigation was beginning to strain that tradition. If the stories surrounding the Swiss accounts continue to grow, it could transform from a quiet internal dispute into a public controversy, one that raised uncomfortable questions about the Queen's private legacy. And as the tension inside the palace deepened, the sense of uncertainty grew with it. Advisors realized they were no longer dealing with a simple financial matter. They were navigating a conflict involving trust, authority, and the interpretation of the Queen's final intentions. Each conversation seemed to uncover another layer of complexity. Yet even as palace tensions grew, Sophie prepared to take a step few expected. There are moments in royal history when quiet diplomacy gives way to something stronger. According to insiders, Sophie reached that moment when she sent a direct request for a private meeting with senior palace lawyers and insisted that the restrictions on the Swiss accounts be fully explained. For someone who had spent years navigating palace life through patience and restraint, the decision marked a dramatic shift. Sophie had always understood that royal influence often worked best behind the scenes, through subtle conversations and carefully managed compromise, but the situation surrounding the Swiss accounts had moved beyond quiet negotiation. Too many questions had been left unanswered. Too many explanations had felt incomplete. The document referencing the Queen's personal directives had only intensified the contradiction. If those instructions truly existed, then the refusal to grant Sophie access could no longer be dismissed as routine legal caution. It demanded a clear explanation. The request for the meeting was delivered formally, but unmistakably firm. Sophie wanted the palace legal team present, and she wanted clarity regarding the restrictions that had suddenly appeared around the accounts. The message was carefully worded, but its intent was unmistakable. This was no longer an inquiry. It was a demand for answers. When the meeting finally took place, the atmosphere was controlled but undeniably tense. The lawyers arrived with prepared documents, legal references, and a carefully constructed defense of their decision. From the beginning, their position remained consistent. The accounts, they explained, were subject to strict legal protections activated after the Queen's passing. These protections, they insisted, were not optional measures. They were mandatory safeguards designed to protect private financial structures during periods of transition. Their duty, they emphasized repeatedly, was to ensure those safeguards were enforced without exception. Sophie listened carefully, but those present at the meeting later suggested it was clear she was not satisfied with the explanation. The legal language sounded familiar, yet it failed to address the deeper issue she had raised from the beginning. Eventually, she responded with a quiet but powerful reminder. She spoke about the conversations she had once shared with the Queen, discussions that had taken place long before the current restrictions were ever mentioned. In those private moments, she explained, the Queen had spoken about the future of certain financial arrangements and the importance of protecting them carefully. The implication was clear. Sophie believed she had been entrusted with a responsibility tied directly to those very accounts. For a brief moment, the room reportedly fell silent. The lawyers did not deny that the Queen may have discussed such matters privately, but they quickly returned to the same position they had held from the beginning. Personal conversations, they argued, could not override formal legal structures. Their obligation was to follow documented procedures governing the accounts, not informal understandings or verbal assurances. That response deepened the tension rather than easing it. From Sophie's perspective, the explanation felt incomplete. The lawyers spoke about protocols and restrictions, but they still avoided the central question she had asked weeks earlier. Who had activated those protections? Someone had authorized the decision that now blocked her access. Yet once again, no name was offered. As the discussion continued, it became increasingly clear that neither side was prepared to change its position. Sophie maintained that the Queen's intentions should be honored. The legal team insisted they were already fulfilling their duty by enforcing the protections surrounding the accounts. Each argument circled back to the same unresolved contradiction. Eventually, the meeting ended without resolution. No agreement was reached. No access was granted. And the question Sophie had brought into the room remained unanswered. But if the palace lawyers believed the discussion had settled the matter, they had misjudged her resolve. According to insiders, Sophie made it clear that she was not prepared to abandon the issue. If necessary, she would continue seeking answers through other channels. That possibility quickly unsettled palace officials who had hoped the matter would remain contained within quiet legal discussions. The idea that the dispute could escalate further created an uncomfortable risk. If the story surrounding the accounts continued to grow, it could draw unwanted attention to financial arrangements the monarchy had always kept carefully private. Reputation, discretion, and trust were all suddenly at stake. Yet even as those concerns spread through the palace, Sophie continued searching for clarity, because something about the accounts still did not make sense. The resistance she encountered felt stronger than simple legal caution. It felt as though someone was determined to keep her away from the truth. But what Sophie would discover next might explain why the accounts had suddenly become so sensitive. Months after Sophie's first demand for answers, the mystery surrounding the Queen's Swiss accounts remains unresolved. The palace has issued no detailed explanation. The lawyers have not reversed their decision, and Sophie, according to insiders, has not abandoned her search for the truth. Time, which usually softens royal disputes, has done little to quiet the tension surrounding the accounts. The legal barrier placed around them remains firmly in place, untouched and unaltered, despite the waves of questions that have moved quietly through palace corridors. Officially, nothing has changed. The accounts are still sealed under the same restrictive custodial oversight the lawyers announced months earlier. No further clarification has been issued, no public acknowledgement offered. The silence has been deliberate, almost calculated, as though the palace hopes the story will simply fade into the background of royal life. But inside those walls, the uncertainty has not faded. Sophie, by all accounts, has not stepped away from the issue. Those familiar with her position say she continues to examine every fragment of information connected to the Queen's private financial legacy, not aggressively, not recklessly, but persistently. The same quiet determination that once earned her the Queen's trust now fuels her search for clarity. She has never publicly accused anyone of wrongdoing, never escalated the matter into open conflict. Yet the message behind her actions remains unmistakable. She believes the story of the Swiss accounts is incomplete. Among royal insiders, opinions about the situation remain deeply divided. Some believe the matter will eventually resolve itself quietly, just as many sensitive royal disputes have in the past. According to this view, the legal protections surrounding the accounts simply require time. Estate structures, financial approvals, and institutional safeguards often move slowly, particularly when dealing with assets that were intentionally designed to remain discreet. Those advisors argue that patience, not confrontation, will ultimately bring the clarity Sophie seeks. But others inside the royal orbit are far less certain. They point to the contradictions that have surrounded the accounts from the very beginning: the sudden legal restriction, the mysterious document referencing the Queen's directives, the refusal to name who authorized the oversight. Each of those details continues to linger like a shadow over the entire situation. And as months pass without resolution, the unanswered questions seem to grow rather than disappear. Outside observers have also begun to notice something unusual. Not an official scandal, not an open controversy, but a subtle tension that occasionally surfaces in the quiet corners of royal reporting. Journalists who follow palace affairs closely have hinted that something unusual occurred behind closed doors after the Queen's passing. They speak cautiously, carefully avoiding claims they cannot prove. Yet the suggestion remains. The story of the Queen's private financial legacy may not be as straightforward as the palace would prefer. Meanwhile, the accounts themselves remain untouched, locked behind layers of legal protection and international confidentiality. Swiss banking traditions ensure that their contents remain invisible to the outside world. No numbers have been revealed, no details confirmed. In many ways, the accounts have returned to the same place they occupied for decades, hidden within a financial architecture designed to protect royal privacy above all else. And yet, the question that started everything still lingers. Why was Sophie blocked? It is a question that continues to echo quietly through palace circles. Was the restriction simply a matter of legal procedure, as the lawyers insisted? Or did it represent something more complicated, an internal decision that someone within the royal structure had made deliberately? For now, there are no definitive answers. Only speculation, fragments of evidence, and a mystery that refuses to disappear. In the world of royal history, secrets have a strange way of resurfacing when least expected. Documents appear, testimonies change, hidden details slowly move into the light. And that possibility is what keeps the story alive. Because in the world of royal secrets, unanswered questions rarely stay buried forever, and the truth behind those accounts may still be waiting to surface. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.